Okay, let's get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Snack and Learn webinar. Just mentioning some housekeeping items before we start. This webinar is a bit longer than usual. It's around 45 minutes with a 30 minutes presentation followed by around 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A. There will be time for the questions, so if you can log your questions in the question box, this can be found in the control panel of this application, and also there you can find in the handout box the presentation slides as a PDF. So I will hand it over to the team to start the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon, and welcome everyone to Roadmaps to Net Zero, co-creating decarbonization pathways for large organizations. My name is Jeff Irvin. I'm a vice president with WSP's Sustainability, Energy, and Climate Change team, part of our broader climate resilience and sustainability practice here in the US. I'm joined by my colleagues, Catherine Gross, who is a project director based in Bethlehem and leads our road mapping domain, and Angie Zhang, who's also a project director based in New York City and leads our target setting domain. So today we're going to take you through the journey of how WSP supports large organizations on their net zero journey. This is going to be a 4-step process, starting with developing a GHG inventory, working towards setting a science-based target, developing a reduction model for developing an achievement pathway for those targets, and then compiling those into a high-level program roadmap. We will save time at the end for questions, and we're excited to talk to you today. So before we begin, we just wanted to highlight some of the services that WSP provides large organizations on their net zero journey. Our CRS team works across the sustainability spectrum, and you can see some of the services we offer to clients here, both in the public sector and the private sector. Today, we're going to focus on the goal and target setting and road mapping components of our services, but you can see some of our other offerings which span the value chain for large organizations. Now, to give a preview of the 4 steps that we're going to walk through today, we start with a GHG inventory, or a greenhouse gas inventory. This really serves as the baseline from which progress is measured for large organizations. Once an organization has established their baseline through a comprehensive and complete GHG inventory, they move towards setting science-based targets and net zero goals. To develop these targets, we often support clients in modeling achievement pathways through the identification of GHG reduction levers and pathways, and this involves significant amounts of stakeholder engagement, as we'll talk about today. Once a target has been set and a roadmap and pathway developed, these can be packaged together into comprehensive and formal low carbon transition plans. This is going to be an iterative process, so we'll take you through each step of the journey. And as I mentioned, stakeholder engagement is really critical throughout each of these steps that we'll talk about today.
Thanks, Jeff.
So now I'll hand over to Catherine.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. As Jeff mentioned, the first step in the corporate net zero journey is to develop a greenhouse gas inventory. Before we discuss the inventory process, we wanted to start with the basics on greenhouse gases. So greenhouse gases trap and hold heat from the sun in the atmosphere and warm the planet's surface. So when we think about the primary anthropogenic sources, which are caused or influenced by human activities of greenhouse gas emissions, it's the burning of fossil fuels for electricity, heat, and transportation. A list of the 7 greenhouse gases are on the right-hand side of this slide, and these are the gases covered by the Kyoto Protocol and should be included in a company's greenhouse gas inventory. Greenhouse gas emissions are organized into 3 different categories, or we call them scopes, in order to indicate a company's degree of influence and to avoid double counting. Scope 1 emissions are direct emissions. They're the emissions from assets that are owned or controlled by the company. Scope 2 emissions are indirect emissions. These are emissions from purchased energy, such as electricity, steam, chilled water, things that are consumed by the company. And then Scope 3 emissions are other indirect emissions, and they are from the company's value chain. So think of the suppliers and customers of the company. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol provides 5 greenhouse gas accounting and reporting principles to follow when doing a greenhouse gas inventory. The principles are 1, relevance, so ensuring that the inventory appropriately reflects the emissions of the company. 2, completeness, which is accounting for and reporting on all the emission sources and activities within the chosen inventory boundary. 3 is consistency, making sure you're using consistent methodologies to allow for meaningful comparisons of emissions over time. 4 is accuracy, so ensuring that the quantification of emissions is systematically neither over nor under actual emissions. And then the last principle is transparency, addressing all relevant issues in a factual and coherent manner and ensuring that you have a clear audit trail. These 5 principles apply to all greenhouse gas inventories, and it's balancing them that's part of completing an inventory. You may find that there's a need to prioritize one principle over another. So a greenhouse gas inventory is a standardized method for a company to be able to compile a list of their emission sources and quantify emissions related to each of those sources. The steps for developing an inventory are broken out into 4 major components shown here. So step 1, scoping and plan. Step 2, collecting data, collecting all that activity data, reviewing it for accuracy, and determining if there's any missing data or estimations needed. Step 4, which is calculating the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and then step 3, calculating, and then step 4, finalizing and reporting those emissions and publishing the inventory and the report. So WSP sometimes provides turnkey solutions where we do all of these steps for a client. In other cases, clients may be using third-party software where we are helping them with some of these steps. I'm now going to turn it over to Angie, who will walk us through a client example of step 1.
Great, thank you, Catherine. So this case study that I'll share today is a global retailer that our team has partnered with for close to a decade now. And I think it's a really great case study because our experience with them really spans the whole net zero journey that we describe in this presentation. Unfortunately, this is a confidential client, so we have anonymized all of the data that's in this presentation, but I hope it's still a useful kind of practical example for you as we go through these steps. So every single year, we perform an annual inventory development process with the client, and we work with their sustainability department and also key stakeholders like procurement to obtain what Catherine mentioned was the activity data. So this is everything like invoices from their retail stores about how many kilowatt hours of electricity or how much natural gas was consumed, or how much they spent on certain goods and services in the year. And we apply the most relevant emission factors each year to calculate their inventory. So as you can see from the chart, their scope 1 and 2 emissions are a really small piece of their overall footprint. And so these include the activities that are within their direct control. So this is electricity and fuel use at their retail stores, at distribution centers, manufacturing facilities, and through their fleet vehicles. The bigger piece of their impact lies in their value chain. So this is the upstream and downstream impacts that are not within their direct operational control, but certainly within a company's sphere of influence. So we've broken this out in this pie chart on the right. And you can see the bulk of their scope 3 emissions come from the procurement of raw materials, other goods and services, and also the movement of those services between the suppliers, intermediate suppliers, the company to their retail stores, and then the retail stores to their customers. So this GHG inventory is really the basic building block and foundation of all of our net zero work. And it's really critical to understand and be able to measure their impact before a meaningful target or roadmap can be developed.
Great, thanks, Angie. So the second step after the greenhouse gas inventory in a corporate net zero journey is to set a science-based target. So science-based targets are about aligning with the latest climate science and ensuring that corporate GHG reduction targets are sufficiently ambitious to limit the worst effects of climate change. So this involves setting a target that meets the goals of the Paris Agreement to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees C and pursue efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees C. Science-based targets have 4 primary benefits for companies. Innovation, so targets can inform business strategy, and this may lead to the development of low carbon processes, technologies, services, and products. Profitability, so companies with public emissions reduction targets deliver better returns on invested capital. Reputation, so companies committed to reducing global climate impacts can enhance employee recruitment and retention. And then lastly, risk mitigation. Companies have proactively assessed carbon risks and understand the mitigation opportunities are often better prepared for both voluntary and mandatory GHG emissions limits. But how are science-based targets different? So science-based targets are different because they're about aligning with climate science and ensuring that corporate GHG targets are sufficiently ambitious to limit the worst effects of climate change. It's about not just doing good, but doing enough for the climate. The latest climate science indicates that significant global greenhouse gas emissions reductions are imperative. And science-based target setting methods give us the tools we need to translate these climate scenarios into the meaningful corporate GHG reduction targets. So Angie's going to talk through, continue working through the client example of the science-based target setting.
Great. So what does this mean in practice to have a science-based target? I think as you've probably seen in the news in recent years, there's a lot of concern around greenwashing or lack of transparency around corporate target setting. Like, what does it mean to be, carbon neutral or net zero? And is it an apples to apples comparison when you're looking at targets across different companies? And this is where the Science-Based Targets Initiative really comes into play. SBTi is really the leading corporate climate action initiative, which provides industry standards and a validation service for setting science-based targets. And I think by the end of 2023, over 4,000 companies and financial institutions set validated targets through SBTi, and this includes both major corporations and also small and medium-sized companies. So some examples are AstraZeneca, JLL, Sony, and of course WSP. WSP has a near-term and net zero target through SBTi. This is something that we've supported dozens of clients on over the years. And with this retail client in particular, one of the first steps was to help them really understand what the requirements were for setting a target with SBTi. SBTi produces a corporate net zero standard as well as sector-specific guidance for some sectors that are hard to abate. And in this guidance, which they update pretty regularly, they lay out the specific requirements of what constitutes a science-based target. So that includes everything from what percentage of scope 1 and 2 and scope 3 emissions must be included within the boundary of your target, your minimum requirements for target ambition. So by 2030, this is a 46% reduction, 46.2% reduction in scope 1 and 2 emissions, and a 27.5% reduction in scope 3 emissions. And they also provide guidance around target type and methodology. Most of the companies that we work with end up setting absolute reduction targets, so like a 90% reduction off of baseline, or some companies also set intensity-based targets. So with this retailer client, the first step is that we held a kickoff meeting with stakeholders across business units to really understand the requirements, establish some target literacy around what these different target components mean, and start to build ownership of the target. Next slide, please. So in addition to understanding the target requirements, the other really important data point that's needed in target setting is a snapshot of where the business anticipates going, absent any additional climate mitigation or target setting. Because in reality, you're not just reducing from your current levels of GHG emissions, but most companies are hoping to grow and expand their operations. And so future business as usual emissions are likely going to be a lot higher than your current year emissions. So it's in getting leadership to really understand and approve a target, it's critical for them to understand the scale of reductions that's needed to achieve the target in the target year. So, a 46.2% reduction from 2019 emissions could very well equate to a 90% or 80% reduction from forecasted 2030 emissions. And so this step really helps companies grasp the sort of the seriousness of the commitment that they're making and be very realistic about it. Next slide. All right, so this is the forecast that we developed with our retail client. This client was very collaborative, and they put together a net zero working group that was comprised of each of their business units. And we worked with these stakeholders through interviews and workshops to understand what the projected short-term and long-term changes they were anticipating to their business activities were. So for example, we spoke to their procurement team about projected spend for certain emissions intensive raw goods. We spoke with HR about what they thought their employee growth forecasts looked like, and as well as some of their business travel plans about returning to pre-COVID levels of business travel. And we also spoke with their store development team on anticipated future store closures and expansion and renovations. And so using all of that, we built those assumptions into each of these emission sectors and developed a forecast. And as you can see, there's a lot of growth anticipated absent any additional greenhouse gas interventions from the client. And what this helped the client do was that they confirmed with leadership that they wanted to set a net zero target, which is a 90% reduction in overall emissions by 2040 was the year that they picked. And they also really wanted to be a leader in their field. And so the information that we developed here helps them adopt a slightly more ambitious near-term target than what the minimum SBTi requirements were.
Thanks, Angie. So this sets up the third step that we're going to talk about now in the corporate net zero journey, which is to develop a model and identify emissions reduction levers. So what exactly is a model? So you can think about a model as a simplification of the real world. In this case, it's a simplification of a client's sustainability program and the levers that they'll pull to achieve a target and some of the outcomes, including greenhouse gas emissions reductions. We can simplify a model down to these three components here in orange. There's inputs, there's processes and rules, and then there's outputs. So the inputs include both company-specific projections as well as external projections. We'll talk a little bit more about the target assumptions and toggles on the next slide. Some examples of the processes and rules include the timeline, so how long the client has to achieve the target, the calculation formulas, which could include for emissions, but also costs and savings, and then any relationships between the inputs. So for example, electrification may move some fuel inputs from the fuel column to the electricity column. And then for our outputs, this will include time series of these results, including emissions, cost savings, and other factors. It also includes scenarios potential. So we want to be able to illustrate with our model the different pathways and show the uncertainty or the level of uncertainty that the client has in achieving their goals. And then lastly, we want to make it accessible, especially for a wide variety of stakeholders. And so we typically include visuals and graphs to help illustrate the results of the model. So a set of inputs that was on the last slide that are key when developing a model are the target assumptions and components. So our targets and typical greenhouse gas reduction targets have common aspects that we always want to put into a model. This includes whether it's a reduction target or an intensity target, what the boundary of the target is, so the scopes of emissions that are included in the activities, the level of ambition. So as the example here, 50% reduction, and then your target year and your base year. So in this case, this is just sort of a dummy case. The target year is 2030 and the base year is 2023, or whatever the specifics are for a given client. So when you're starting the development of a model, it's helpful to map out how the data will flow as a first step. Once you've mapped out this flow, you can start to think about the emissions reduction levers and begin thinking about identifying them. We can think about levers using this reduction hierarchy that you can see here on the slide. Our emissions are going to be equal to the activity data, so for any given activity, multiplied by an emissions factor. Essentially, our two options for reducing emissions and in identifying levers are either 1, to reduce the activity, or 2, to reduce the emissions factor. So here are some example strategies that fit into those buckets. So we have efficiency, so this is doing more with less or the same. You can also no longer do the activity, so we might change our business process. On the emissions factor side, we can switch to renewable electricity, we can fuel switch, we can engage suppliers to get lower emissions factors. Those are all example strategies. Each of these strategies can have individual levers underneath them, as you can see here in the light orange and blue. This is just a simple diagram of how to think about these emissions reduction levers. It's by no means a complete list. There are many more strategies and levers. I'm now going to turn it back over to Angie, who will show this in the client example.
Great, thanks, Catherine. So that's exactly the first step we did. We took that high-level list of strategies that are really broadly applicable across most of the companies that we work with, and we went to the Net Zero Working Group to vet the strategies and to really tailor them to their specific business context. We discussed things like the feasibility of certain strategies, the extent to which they could be implemented within their business context, the costs, and also, of course, some new ideas that the client had in each of these different emissions categories. We held a workshop with the Net Zero Working Group, and during that workshop, we discussed questions such as, the feasibility of electrifying certain pieces of equipment or processes, whether electric alternatives were feasible right now, or whether there were emerging technologies to be considered. We thought about some of their key supplier relationships and whether there were some existing opportunities to partner with some of these suppliers. And then I think most importantly is, obviously our team is an expert on greenhouse gas emissions, but we're by no means the expert on retail strategy or procurement or inventory management. And so it was really important to really deeply kind of understand these pieces with the client themselves to understand and surface what might be a transformative strategy in that 10 to 15 year time range, because this is a roadmap not just for 2030, but out to 2040. And so it's important to keep tracking the new technologies and products and more efficient services that might be available. And then once we refined that list of strategies, we got to work on a quantitative model. So for each of these more detailed strategies, we built out specific assumptions around the percentage of reductions that they could gain. And some of the strategy quantification was based off of actual client data. So for example, concurrently with this work, we were also doing on-site solar feasibility assessments with the client. And so we were able to directly plug in the amount of megawatt hours of solar generation potential that we had identified for a couple of their manufacturing facilities and translate that into annual GHG reductions for the client. And then, of course, some of these other assumptions are ones that we just had to kind of think about what the most reasonable assumption would be. And we worked with the client collaboratively. We were transparent and documented all of our assumptions, and then calculated out the GHG reduction potential of each of these strategies.
Great, thanks, Angie. So this leads us into the last step in the corporate net zero journey that we're going to talk about today, which is creating a high-level program roadmap. So it's important to have the fundamentals of your target in mind before you start road mapping. So we showed in this case of the client example, we had the target in mind, and then we started this road mapping process. So when you think about a program roadmap, we have one definition here on the slide. And as you know, companies are often setting goals and targets, including for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So once a company has a greenhouse gas reduction goal, a roadmap is a really key tool to define how that goal and target will be achieved. So a successful roadmap provides companies with a clear and iterative path to achieving their objectives. You can see on the right-hand side of the slide some of the things that a successful roadmap includes or involves in the development. So executive sponsorship, making sure that the goals are clearly defined, having a defined timeline, identifying and prioritizing achievement measures, etc. The lower left is a snapshot of part of WSP Global's roadmap, and it shows the cost, who is responsible, what exactly are the actions that are happening, and when. There are two different approaches to program road mapping. So there's a top-down approach and a bottom-up approach. In a top-down program roadmap approach, this is more often the beginner approach. It breaks down emissions in the target by scope. It identifies high-level strategies by emission source, and then identifies actions to achieve those high-level strategies and the associated impacts. In contrast, a bottom-up program roadmap approach, it's a little bit more of the advanced approach. It has specific targets by activity or site level that are established. The activity or site level specific targets are then consolidated to roll up into an overall target. And then you identify the gap to achieving the overall target based on those activity and site level targets. So it's not a top-down approach or a bottom-up approach. Both approaches are helpful and they're complementary. Many clients start with the top-down approach, because that's more of the beginner approach. Less specific data is needed, but we encourage our clients to later build in that bottom-up detail as they have it. So Angie is now going to walk us through the client example of this.
Great. So here's where everything kind of all comes together. This is our overall roadmap to net zero for this retail client. And as you can see, hopefully the shape of this chart is familiar. It's our business as usual forecast from earlier. That's just overlaid with the expected GHG reductions modeled for each of those strategy groups like energy, transportation, et cetera. And what the roadmap shows us is that 2030, that target, we've modeled it to be well within their achievement potential for them. 2040, however, and this is really common for a lot of the clients that we work with, there's a gap between the strategies that we've identified through the roadmap and their 2040 goal. And I think this is just something that's very, very common about net zero targets. It's that it's a bit of a leap of faith for clients, that there's a lot of uncertainty with the future. There's new technology that might be emerging, new strategies that are needed. And I think it really emphasized an important thing that Catherine mentioned, which is that road mapping is really an iterative exercise. This is not a plan that you just do once and it kind of sits on the shelf and you're done. But companies should be revisiting their roadmaps. They should be course correcting. They should be adding new strategies over time. So next slide, please. The second thing I want to emphasize here is that we also really want roadmaps to be actionable. So that wedge chart previously shows the overall pathway, but we also want to drill down into each of the strategy levels and each of the levers to help the client really understand what's needed to implement that strategy and achieve the reductions that we modeled. And so I think one key thing is that these business units don't speak in GHG emissions, and so it's really important to translate these into functional targets and metrics. For example, for this lever, which is in the transportation sector, what might be more meaningful for business units and those stakeholders are the percentage of shipments that go by certain transit modes, or the percentage of diesel fuel consumption in fleet vehicles, or the number of new electric vehicles that they've added to the fleet each year. These are things that are tangible, that they can work with, that they can manage and track over time, and will lead to greenhouse gas reductions. So we worked for all of the different strategies and levers. We worked on populating these metrics and identifying also some initial implementation steps for the client. And I'll end the client example with what I think is a really encouraging note, which is that we wrapped up this target setting and roadmap effort about a year and a half ago now. And since then, we have tackled a couple new scopes of work with this client to actually implement some of the levers in their roadmap. So more recently, we finished a scope of work around establishing a retail store decarbonization strategy. We've also been working, and I think it's ongoing work, to develop a supplier engagement program for the client. And so this is really an excellent example of a roadmap in action. I'll hand it back to you, Catherine.
Thanks, Angie. as Angie mentioned throughout the presentation, the importance of the Net Zero Working Group as part of this client example. So I just wanted to underscore the importance of stakeholder engagement as being a key for success in developing a program roadmap that is actionable. This client example was a great example of that. As Angie mentioned, we're continuing to implement this and helping them reach their near-term and net zero target. And I think a lot of that was due to the engagement and involvement of this net zero working group from the beginning. So through this stakeholder engagement, it can foster connections, trust, confidence, build buy-in for program road mapping. And when it's done really well, stakeholder engagement can lead to improved decision-making, increased understanding and buy-in, improved communications, greater understanding, as well as a greater likelihood of project implementation and overall success. And to be really blunt, program road mapping without stakeholder engagement will likely fail or not be as successful as it could have been. So it's important to lead with stakeholder engagement. Truly impactful roadmaps not only require buy-in from the top of organizations, but they require input from stakeholders across the organization throughout the process. And this is what happened with the Net Zero Working Group. Road mapping is both a technical exercise and a stakeholder engagement exercise. So even if you had the most technically perfect roadmap, it's going to be useless if those who are tasked with implementing it either don't understand how to use it, don't know how to translate the metrics into something concrete, or maybe they don't support the actions recommended in the roadmap. So in particular, stakeholder engagement includes meaningful engagement with underserved and under-resourced stakeholders early and often. This stakeholder engagement can take various methods. Some common methods we use are surveys, stakeholder interviews, and stakeholder workshops. We don't have time today to go into the details of each of these methods. That could be a whole separate webinar. But I'm now going to turn it over to Jeff, who will talk about governance and implementation, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Thanks, Catherine. So building on the point that Catherine just made, a roadmap is only as good as its implementation. And to ensure successful implementation, a robust governance framework is needed. And this can be built into the roadmap and the final low carbon transition plan, and it really is customized depending on the organization. There are, however, certain key themes that any governance framework should touch on. These include accountability and staffing, flexibility and feedback mechanisms to ensure the ability to course correct if progress is off track, board awareness and involvement, so understanding and buy-in to the very top of the organization, and then related to accountability, incentives to make sure that the staff implementing the plan have the right incentives in place to meet their targets. And so these are all taken from frameworks like the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, or TCFD. And having this type of governance program in place will help with reporting on progress to the plan as well as implementation. So before we go to questions, we just wanted to wrap up the key takeaways and the 4 steps that we talked about. The first is establishing a baseline through a GHG inventory. This should be complete, but even if your data is not yet quite mature, it shouldn't prevent you from setting science-based targets. The SBTi establishes the criteria for companies to align with the Paris Agreement, but there are other organizations such as ISO standards that offer standards as well. Once a target is set, a company can move towards modeling and lever identification, and this is really where stakeholder engagement becomes critical. It's also an opportunity to weave in environmental justice principles into the achievement plan of the roadmap. And then lastly, formalizing the plan into a low carbon transition plan is a key final step to not just get buy-in internally, but also to report publicly on progress towards the goals. And so with that, we're happy to move into questions now and to answer the questions that have been provided in the chat.
Thank you all, fantastic presentation. Just mentioning the housekeeping items again, please continue to log your questions in the question box on the control panel, and also you can find there in the handout box the presentation slides as a PDF. I will start with the first question. How do you manage stakeholders once you identify them during the road mapping process?
Yeah, I can take that one first, and then Jeff or Angie, if you want to jump in. Oftentimes, so one way to do it is to create an engagement plan. and to outline objectives and milestones over time and be able to check in with them regularly, monthly or quarterly, whatever makes sense. With the Net Zero Working Group with this client, we had sort of a clear timeline and clear milestones and clear engagement milestones with them, where we were asking them for input and feedback and support. Every company has a different internal culture, and so the management of stakeholders, it's really important that it aligns with that existing culture, so it's not kind of a lift and shift type of thing, and it's really, you need to understand the client and the company and what would work best, and then sort of build that engagement plan and framework around that. Jeff or Angie, anything you want to add?
Just that consistency is key, and there's a balance to it. I think most stakeholders that you would be engaging in this process have other aspects of their jobs that don't have to do with sustainability. So you need to be mindful of their time, but also engage them consistently enough so that they're not surprised or unaware of aspects of the plan and what they're expected to do once the plan is finalized.
Thank you. The next question is about funding. At what point should the topic of funding come up during the road mapping process?
I would say it should be a topic of conversation from the beginning. You need to understand the high level costs, and typically what we see is a narrowing in of costs as the target pathway is finalized. So often through the development of a model and certain heuristics, we can give a high level estimate of both costs and savings, and then start to hone in based on the specific levers that are decided on through that step 3 process. But it really should be a topic of conversation from the beginning, so stakeholders across the organization are aware of what they're committing to.
Yeah, and I would just add to that and say that those financial metrics can potentially be broken down in the model by which company stakeholders would be responsible for these costs and benefit from the savings, so that it's very clear from the beginning what will be expected of them and what savings they can expect as well.
Thank you. There's a question here on step 3 that you mentioned. There are inputs and of cost. Is it something that is provided by the client, or is it based on literature?
Yeah, I can take this one. So I think the question asked also about the MAC, the marginal abatement cost that we calculated. This is a dollar metric per metric ton of CO2 equivalents reduced, and it's a little bit of both. So for the levers where we had client-specific studies and information, we were able to use either the CapEx or OpEx costs directly from those studies. But a lot of these are just also based on kind of the literature or really like Google searches about like what's the average cost of a REC right now, or of a renewable energy credit right now, and other research into kind of high level reasonable costs for implementation of certain strategies.
Fantastic, thank you. Were there any particular challenges when quantifying Scope 3 emission?
I can start. I think quantifying Scope 3 emissions is always a challenge, and it really starts with just what's the availability of what we call activity data. So that's kind of measurements of the activities contributing to the emissions. So in the case of Scope 3, that might be spend that a company has with their suppliers. It may also include units of purchased in physical units, so tons of product procured, for example. And so just getting that data and getting it organized is the first challenge, and then getting emission factors. So those are units of emissions intensity, or emissions per dollar spent, emissions per number of products purchased, getting those to be specific to the products rather than just industry averages is the next challenge that almost all organizations face. And Angie and Catherine, I don't know if you want to add anything specific in the client profile.
Only thing I'll say is that I think often the goal is to be able to get more specific client-specific data, and instead we end up using a lot of sort of global averages and proxies of like a common emission factor that we use for purchased goods and services is from the USEIO, the economic input-output factors that are created looking at that nationwide economy. And so these are not specific to the client. And the challenge with that is when you go to start modeling reduction strategies, the only way to reduce those emissions is by reducing spend, unfortunately. And so a large part of our strategies also focus on what's kind of the, I would say, like the supporting levers that need to be developed to even enable the company to better measure their indirect impacts, like their Scope 3 impacts.
Thank you. What software or tool is used to work out the model and roadmap?
This one specifically is Excel.
I was going to say, oftentimes we use Excel.
Yeah, and I would add that increasingly visualization of progress is key. So we've been integrating applications like Power BI to illustrate the results of the models. And then we do also work with companies who are using third-party software platforms and supplementing the tools that are built into those enterprise software tools as well. But often it's kind of a spreadsheet or data model-based approach.
Thank you. The next question is about that data accuracy. Is there data on accuracy of implementation plans for cost and GHG reduction for performance versus models?
I would say that there is not a comprehensive summary, because oftentimes it's only become more recent that companies have been making the details of their plans public, and as there's been pressure to do this from regulation as well as best practices and frameworks like the TCFD that I mentioned. But the SBTi has produced an annual report on the progress of companies that have committed to set science-based targets and set them through the SBTi. And thus far in those reports, they've shown that most companies are exceeding the level of reduction that they need to hit their targets. So on average, companies are exceeding their pathways, but each incremental step becomes a little bit more harder on a marginal basis.
And I'd also just add to that, like this program road mapping process it's very iterative. So it's recommended that clients return to the roadmap, the goals, the peer benchmarking every year or every other year, just to make sure that it's up to date and that the assumptions are still accurate.
Fantastic. I will take the last question, and all additional questions that were unanswered will be answered directly by the presenters. How much of the net zero roadmap model is built on assumptions of future action versus actual plans by the company or stakeholders?
I can take this one. So I would say actually the majority of the net zero roadmap is built off of assumptions about future actions, because the timeline that we're looking at is from now until 2030, 2040, 2050. There is, some portion of the levers that we look at are plans that the company already has in place, or is kind of, these are imminent plans. But for the most part, those only kind of go out to the next 3 to 5 years. So yeah, I would say like maybe 80% of this is all future action.
Yeah, especially when it comes to the modeling part. Once we get to a formalized low carbon transition plan, there may be commitments of funding to achieve those actions. So while the levers and achievement of them is in the future, the commitment of funding is in the present. And I think that's an important aspect of the governance slide that I spoke to, and the nature of making those low carbon transition plans public, so that commitment of funding there's accountability to that, and organizations are held responsible for the funding that they've committed to achieve the levers in the future.
Yeah. And also why stakeholder engagement is so important, because we want to, these business units to really take ownership of this plan and turn these future assumptions into actual plans that the company is going to adopt.
Fantastic. Thank you for clarifying this. Thank you, Angie, Catherine, and Jeff, for a fantastic presentation. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you for your questions. And that's it. We will wrap up the session now. So thanks, everyone, for joining us today.